For those of you already on, just to let you know, we've got a lot of people joining us this morning, and I'm just allowing more people to enter the Zoom room. But we'll get started in just a minute or so. All right. Well, we still have bunches of people still joining. I'll try to be a little bit long-winded in my introduction to allow them to enter without missing anything. Good morning. Welcome to the Middle East Institute. I am Ken Pollack, the Vice President for Policy here at the Middle East Institute, and we're delighted to have you join us for another one of our video briefings. In just a moment, I'll introduce our two speakers. I think you're all aware that our topic for this morning is the reaction, the impact of the new war with Iran on the Gulf states. We are entirely on the record today. This program is being recorded and being live streamed. Later, we will post it on our YouTube channel. I will let everyone know that it is 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, March 4th, so that future viewers of that videotape will understand that we are limited to our understanding of the world as of 9:30 a.m. on March 4. Please do not hold our speakers responsible for what happens after that. In addition, we'll start off, I'll pose some big, broad questions to our two speakers, but hopefully at around the halfway mark, we will shift over to questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, you are welcome to do so. Please do it by using the Q&A function, the question and answer function on Zoom. And if you're not familiar with the Q&A function, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will find a Q&A button located between the green share screen button and the show captions button. If you click on that, it brings up a dialog box. You can type your question into the dialog box, and then I will integrate the questions and ask the speakers to respond to them as we move along. So please do feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function. All right. With that, let me quickly introduce our two speakers. I think most of our viewers know I am not a fan of long introductions because I like to get right to the point. But as always, we have two outstanding speakers with us. First, Dan Benaim. Dan was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Gulf states up until 2025. He is also a Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow of the Middle East Institute. And along with him is Greg Gause. Greg is the Dean of American Scholars of the Middle East. And he is also an Associate Fellow of the Middle East Institute. Dan, Greg, it is terrific to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.
Let's jump right into it. Dan, I want to start with you. And the question I want to start with for you is, give us a sense of where the Gulf states were. And by the way, obviously, we've got 6 Gulf states out there. Obviously, they have different perspectives on things. And of course, there are different people within each of these Gulf states with different perspectives, even different important policymakers with different perspectives. Feel free to characterize it however you wish. But I think for our purposes, obviously, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, probably the most important actors out there. Would love you both to focus primarily on them, but do feel free to bring in the Kuwaitis and the Omanis and the Bahrainis wherever you think that it is important to do so. So, Dan, let's start with you. And again, let's start with where you feel that the Gulf states were when this started out. Going into this war, how were the Gulf states thinking about this war? What were they hoping would happen? What were they afraid might happen?
Thanks, Ken, and Greg, and to everybody who's tuned in. First of all, I think you're right to, in general, disaggregate the Gulf states. But actually, I think there was a degree of unanimity before this war in states' apprehension about what it would bring. And I think the fact that Iran has now struck all of the GCC states, I wouldn't say there's total strategic convergence, but there is certainly a degree of it, and just outrage at Iran's choice to violate their sovereignty in response to a war that they didn't want. I think for the Gulf, it's really about kind of Vision 2030 versus Vision 1979 or the spirit of 2003. And the Gulf states really, their dream scenario was last summer when Donald Trump went to the Gulf, praised their gleaming towers, the economic models they were building, the AI chips they were buying, the new industries that were coming, the collaboration on global issues. That's where they want to be and where they're comfortable. And I think, that despite some reporting to the contrary, that this was unanimous that the Gulf states didn't want this war. They know Iran is their adversary, but they didn't want this. This is a big evolution from 2015 era when Gulf states were not comfortable with diplomacy with Iran. They looked at this war like Americans, and they were reading the tea leaves and trying to discern from the various statements what the strategic objective is that's tied to the military objective of weakening Iran's capability and leadership. Is it regime change, a deal to bloody Iran, and then leave them still right nearby with an intact regime? So the difference really matters, and they don't have the luxury of distance. They feared a scenario like this, where they would all be attacked. They warned us of a scenario like this. We haven't seen all the shoes that could drop on the Gulf. The Houthis, and Iraqi militias both have potent capabilities that could be very disruptive to the broad areas that the Gulf seeks to protect from drones and missiles. Those are dogs that haven't barked. This is not about physical damage, even as much as it is about damage to a model. UAE economy is a machine with 1 million Emiratis, 10 million foreigners, talented people, foreign investors, businesses that is required to function. So what's a threat here is not just individual economic losses, but what they're trying to build. And the key question for them before and after, I think, is what gets left behind. Half of what they feared has already happened. The other half is the end state, which may be passé to worry about in Washington these days, but the Gulf still does, and I still do. So they built this détente. It lasted for 5 years, longer than anyone thought it would. It ended last week.
All right, that's a great start, Dan. Greg, let me shift over to you first. If you'd like to add anything to Dan's comments or disagree with them completely, you're welcome to do so. But what I'd like to put to you is, how do you think that thinking has changed since the war has begun? And in particular, as Dan points out, since the Gulf states have really become major targets of the Iranian counteroffensive?
I think Dan is right that there was very little enthusiasm in the Gulf for this attack because they anticipated that they would be on the front lines of the Iranian response. It's very different from last year at the end of the 12-day war, where Iran, did a token strike on Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, largely because President Trump had already declared a ceasefire by the time that had happened. In essence, the conflict was over from the Iranian perspective. This conflict obviously is not over. There's some speculation, and I think it's being picked up by folks who are here in the United States who are opposed to the war, that the Saudis as well as the Israelis were kind of in President Trump's ear, encouraging an attack. The way I read that is that I think Dan is absolutely right. I don't think the Saudis wanted this attack. But my guess, and this is just my speculation, is that as the military buildup in the region continued and it became increasingly clear that something was going to happen, I can imagine the Saudi leadership, the Crown Prince, talking to President Trump saying, well, if you're going to do this, do it right, whatever that means. But, go big or go home kind of message. But I think that Dan is absolutely right that the longer term Gulf interest, and despite the differences among the 6 states, I think this did unite them, is that they were all on a track of let's keep things quiet and stable. Because if we're going to achieve the economic transformations that in almost every one of those countries is in track, we can't live in a war zone. And so I think that the longer term issue here, immediately, to get back to your question, they're all with the United States now, but they didn't really have an option. The United States is their security partner. And so no matter how this turns out, their reliance on the United States is going to be, I think, reaffirmed. But the worries that they had about about the United States, both in terms of reliability, can the United States defend us, and predictability, right? Can we count on the United States to be a stabilizer and not a disruptor, are going to continue. Now, the Gulf states have lived with this for a while, and they will have to continue to live with this because they don't really have an option. But it does seem to me that, final comment on this, it's hard for me to understand the Iranian strategy here. Raining missiles and drones on the UAE. Okay, I kind of understand that somebody's got to pay a price. But why these kind of pinprick missile attacks on other states, on Kuwait, on Oman, which was the mediator? And just this morning we find out, an Iranian missile heading toward Turkey. I'm not sure what the Iranians are thinking, because they are uniting kind of everybody else in the region, who many of whom had real qualms about this Israeli-American campaign, in essence, behind it.
That's great, Greg. And I will just pitch in as an old Iran military analyst. I confess I'm not surprised by any of this. I think you're right. It's counterproductive. Honestly, it's dumb for Iran. But this is actually what we've been expecting from them for 30 years whenever they felt the regime was threatened. Right. And I think that's the critical difference here. Was in the past, our assumption was always that because we wouldn't be going after the regime, we'd get a much more restrained and, quite frankly, rational response from them. But, I can remember war games for 30 years where when the regime was threatening itself, when we said we were coming for the regime, it just became a matter of we just need to inflict as much pain as we possibly can on anyone we think might be able to rein in the Americans. We should also remember we've decapitated them, and we took out probably the most important force for restraint in the entire Iranian regime, which is Ayatollah Khamenei. And it seems like the Revolutionary Guard is far more in charge. They're more aggressive, more belligerent, more risk tolerant. Anyway, great answers, Greg. Love that. All right, the next question I want to put to both of you guys is, and by the way, I'm so glad you both brought up this question of the end state. I think that's hugely important, and I promise you, we're going to come to that. I'm going to ask you both about the end state that the Gulf states are looking for, because I think that's just so important for the audience to understand. But let's start with the conduct of the war right now. Dan, I'll start with you, but then Greg, I'm going to come to you with the same question afterward. What should we be expecting from the Gulf states now during the course of hostilities? What might we expect from them militarily? What might we expect from them diplomatically? I mean, in particular, you have a lot of people wondering, will they on their own begin to participate in the military campaign? And might we see some diplomatic gambits from them? Dan, start us off.
Thanks, Ken. So not to be the stereotypical Gulf expert, but I think that outside of Iran itself, the Gulf really is the center of gravity of this burgeoning conflict as it's taking shape. And that's because the Iranian pressure strategy to marshal indirect pressure on the United States and Israel, on the United States directly, and then the United States to rein in Israel, really runs through the Gulf. It's diplomatic. I think the diplomatic play of trying to scare everybody and intimidate them into suing for peace via America and Israel is failing, and it's having the opposite effect. I think it's military, trying to impose costs on U.S. bases and also on interceptors. One of the advantages that they have is that we have to defend a lot of space in the Gulf, space in Israel, space elsewhere. And there is a question of a kind of foot race between our ability to degrade their capabilities and command and control and the expensive interceptors that are being fired to intercept cheap drones. It's our interceptor stock, the Gulf's interceptor stock, and Israel. So that's a real issue. They're trying to precipitate an end to the war where they can declare victory by surviving. And we're trying to stretch that out and own the clock. And then the last one is economic, where you're seeing the Gulf take a big economic hit to their kind of economic theory, a big economic hit to their actual energy output day by day, revenue-wise. And that pain on the Gulf is also going to be translated. It's already being translated into Europe and slowly to the United States. If it becomes inflationary in the United States, it might be effective over time in actually really causing hastening the end of this war. I think everyone's wondering when this will end. Maybe it'll end when Trump goes to China at the end of the month. We'll have to see. But Gulfies are trying to figure out, how does this end, when does this end, et cetera. Two big shifts: psychological shift, living with waves of ballistic missiles and drones, and not just hitting military targets or embassies, as bad as that is, but apartment buildings, hotels, et cetera. People who haven't felt a sense of fear leaving their house, suddenly wondering about what the next attack is, seeing smoke-filled buildings over their city. It's a psychological effect. But there's also a strategic effect, and there is a kind of rally around effect, as Greg said. They didn't want this war, but Iran is the one who brought this war to them. And so I think that has a big effect. It pushes people to America, even though there is real apprehension about Israel, a kind of Middle East where Israel has military hegemony in the future. I think that there's sort of bafflement and rage about the choice of targets, how and why the UAE took the brunt. Proximity, matters here. But, seeing Oman get hit, it's been pretty dangerous to mediate a Middle East conflict for the last year. Qatar was hit, Oman was hit. So there's no insulation of the kind they thought. When it comes to whether they'll retaliate, I think they're looking at two undesirable outcomes here. One is some kind of token symbolic strike, and then they are on the hook with Iran, who will be looking for a quiet moment to punish them if the regime survives for years to come. And the other is to kind of have their own people taking what they call the taco bet, which is that they will chicken out here and that they won't use their formidable military capabilities to go after the Iranians. So you could see some kind of token strike, but I think there's a great deal of strategic patience and restraint. Diplomatically, I think mediation is a possibility. There are some, like the Omanis, who have been interested in historically. They're quite disappointed with the United States going to war and disappointed with Iran for attacking them. And I think that it's not clear that there's someone to talk to. There's Larijani, who seems to be a preeminent power broker, but the people in charge keep getting killed. So it's hard to actually imagine this kind of process unfolding before the tempo and targets shift a little bit. So I think they're sort of looking and waiting. At some point, the economic pain may become great enough that they actually do what Iran hopes, which is push for American restraint and an end to the war. But I think we're not there yet.
Great, Dan. All right, Greg, I want you to pick up on that, make whatever comments you want. And in particular, I want to put a little follow-on to that, which is, in addition to the general points, are there any circumstances where you could imagine the Gulf states deciding, you know what, we need to end this, and either starting some kind of a backroom diplomatic or back channel diplomatic move to try to bring it to an end, or weighing in with Trump and saying, hey, Mr. President, you got to bring this to an end?
I don't see that as a possibility. I think that the Gulf states are they're policy takers on this, not policy makers. I think that the president will pick up the phone if a Gulf leader calls him, but I'm not sure that the president is going to be guided by Gulf desires on this. I do think that that there will be increasing pressures on the president, mostly from within the United States. Poll numbers and inflationary prognoses and rising prices at the pump for gasoline and splits within his MAGA coalition that might lead him to want to declare victory. I think those will be more important. Getting a little out of my lane here, talking about the Gulf states, but I think those will be more important than Gulf state diplomacy. On the military side, I'll disagree a bit with Dan. I don't think that the Gulf states have any kind of serious military option here. I think we have to remember that the biggest losses, aside from the 6 service people that the United States has lost here, is we had 3 planes shot down, but they were shot down by the Kuwaitis. And so the risk of friendly fire and just confusion in the airspace, I think would make the Gulf states very reluctant to go up in any kind of way, maybe with missiles, but certainly not with aircraft, at a time when the Israelis and the Americans are, dominating the airspace And I just don't know, because I don't know that much about this military stuff. I don't know if there are enough kind of interoperability connections where the United States and Israel can kind of tell friend from foe. And so I think that if I were a Gulf military person, I would be extremely cautious about entering into a fight where friendly fire is as dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than enemy fire on this.
Just to qualify
Yeah,
what Greg
good,
said,
Dan.
which I mean, I think there will be some real apprehension about it. I think if they do it, it probably is a token strike so that they can say that they did it and it's kind of contained. But also, it is worth pointing out that the Gulf states, UAE foremost, but not exclusively, have done a pretty remarkable job of intercepting the drones and missiles that have come in. And I think their militaries really deserve credit for that. That's a multi-year effort to build up that capacity, that native capacity. Qatar shot down 2 Iranian jets. I mean, these are things you never didn't have on your bingo card for 2026, and really do reflect the growing military capability inside the Gulf, notwithstanding some of the challenges you cite when it comes to this sort of big bad strike package. I don't think they will do that. I think they will look to either threaten this and not have to do it or circumscribe it heavily.
Yeah, and I do think that the success that a number of the Gulf states have had in defense, to
Yeah.
some extent, obviates the need for a token strike, because they can say our job is to defend our country, and we've gotten much better at it.
And they have.
Yeah.
Good. All right, so let's now turn to the end state, which you both have rightly brought up several times as really being a critical issue for the Gulf states. Dan, why don't you start us off? Give us your sense of the end state, what the Gulf states would like to see at the end of this.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, so I mean, I think again, they want to get back into the 2030 business as quickly as they can. They recognize that the Middle East is fundamentally different than it was a few weeks ago, but that's where they're going. That's where they've been rowing. So I think from their perspective, they're happy to see Iran weakened always because they've never stopped thinking that Iran was an adversary, a dangerous adversary, etc., whether they manage them economically or otherwise. However, I think this is a place where the Gulf states and Israel diverge significantly, and it's worth kind of unpacking a little bit because they don't have the luxury of distance, because they can be threatened by more different vectors than just medium-range ballistic missiles or one proxy group or another. They are much more worried about what's left inside Iran when this is over. And I think an Iran that lacks centralized control, while maybe it poses a much diminished threat to Israel, is a significant problem for the Gulf and probably for the Levant as well. If you're talking about a situation where the state fragments, where ethnic separatist militias are funded. The Saudis and Emiratis just had a big fight about separatism. The idea that America would consider funding an ethnic militia to divide the territory of Iran and create command and control issues and lack of centralized control over Iran's significant arsenal and network of militias or infrastructure or anything else is a nightmare. I mean, I'm talking about 93 million Iranians and I think probably 35 million Gulfies. So if you end up with millions of people leaving Iran, finding relatives in Dubai, going across the water to some of the natural places that they would look to go, that is totally overwhelming. So that really, really matters and scares the Gulf in a way that it doesn't scare Israel, which has the luxury of a little bit of distance here, or the United States. So I think from their perspective, they would love to see a different Iranian government, but probably not today and not tomorrow, because I don't think they put a lot of stock in the idea that a peaceful uprising is going to hold the country together and take the country to a different place. So instead, in the world of the options that they see before them, I think the idea that they would want a weakened but contained Iran is probably the best realistically available for them in the near term.
So that's great. Thank you, Dan. Greg, I'd like you to do two things. First, any comments you'd like to add to that? I think that's a really important set of questions. But I'd like you to go beyond that. Over the course of the last 14 months or so, you've written a series of really lovely essays for the Middle East Institute, all of which, by the way, are available on the Middle East Institute website. You can find there, but looking at the changing strategic landscape of the Gulf and the region. And so in addition to where you think the Gulf states would like to see the war come out, give us your sense of how the end of the war may change Gulf thinking about Iran, about the relationship with the United States, about a potential relationship with Israel.
So, like Dan, I think that the Gulf states would like to deal with a central government in Iran that controls its territory and can enforce its agreements with the Gulf states and everyone else. I don't think that they have an interest in the breakup of the country. I don't think that they have many tools aside from money that could encourage that. But I do think that they have an interest in an Iran that that decides, given the results of the Gaza war and given the results, the military results that we're seeing of this conflict, decides that they have to build Shia Islamism in one country, which is to say, an Iranian government that's willing to accept limits on its nuclear infrastructure, which of course was on the table in Oman before this conflict started, but perhaps more importantly, is willing to draw back from its very aggressive regional policy of supporting non-state actors. That I think was on the table after the Gaza war, given the decimation of Hezbollah and the destruction of Hamas as a serious military actor. But there's still important Iranian assets in Iraq, the Houthis. Right? So I don't want to underestimate the possibility that we could get an Iranian government that basically says we are doubling down, right? That we are going to continue to pursue the line of Khomeini and Khamenei. We are going to support revolution in this region because we've got nothing to lose anymore, and we are going to dive toward a nuclear weapon as fast as we possibly can. This, I think, is the worst kind of outcome for the Gulf states and for the region and for the United States. The best outcome would be, an Iranian government that is, from the military, some parts of the military establishment, some parts of the clerical establishment that basically form enough of a coherent governing coalition to basically say, we're going to rebuild Iran and build Shia Islam and Shia Islamism in one country.
Terrific. Okay. I'm going to open things up to the questions from the audience. Again, for those of you who'd like to ask questions, please do so using the Q&A function on Zoom. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Click on that. It brings up a dialog box. You can ask your questions. We've got some really good questions here. And I want to start, Greg, with one that is a perfect follow-up to what you just said, which is your expectations. You're thinking about the potential for internal unrest in the Gulf states. If this war again, back to what I said earlier, what the Iranians are doing is exactly what we've predicted that they would try to do for 30 years. And one of the things that was also part of that whole package of Iranian actions was trying to stir up unrest in the GCC states if the war went on for a long time, or if the regime was left in place afterwards and pissed off and looking to get back. So what's your sense of to what extent that this might actually spur greater unrest in the GCC states over time?
I would say that the risk of that in almost all the GCC states is very low. The Iranian assets in those states are limited, I would say, and well surveilled by the regimes in power. The only place where there could be a risk of this, of course, is Bahrain. or the Bahrainis, the Sunni ruling family, the Shia majority. We all know those demographics. It would be the place where perhaps the Iranians could stir the most up. But the Bahrainis are, in many ways, the least significant of the players in this game. The Shia minority in Kuwait is, in many ways, more royalist than anybody these days. And the Shia minority in the Emirates is, I think, extremely well policed, to put it mildly. And so, if there were no major upheavals during the Arab Spring in these places, except for Bahrain, and to some extent in Oman, but mainly Bahrain, I don't see the Iranians being able to foment that kind of unrest, particularly at a time when at least the initial reaction, I think, throughout the Gulf is the Iranians are hitting us unjustifiably. We didn't attack them. And I think that will lessen the ability, at least in the short term, for the Iranians to play into the politics of the Gulf states.
It's great. Okay. We've got a lot of questions, and I'm going to combine them, and I'm going to turn them into a very unfair question to both of you guys, which is about the potential different outcomes and how the Gulf states probably want them. You guys have made, both very compelling arguments that they don't want to see the breakup of Iran. They don't particularly want to see this regime persist, right? There is a third alternative out there, which seems to be what Israel and the United States want, which is the fall of this regime and its replacement by a democratic Iranian regime. Which may or may not get. Maybe that's the least bad option for the Gulf states. Maybe it's not. But that's exactly what all these different questions are more or less getting at. Is given that none of these is probably an ideal outcome for the Gulf states, nonetheless, if they were forced to choose. And let's remember, in 1991, the United States had, this choice of, do we allow Iraq potentially to fragment, or do we allow for the continuation of the regime? We made a choice. Maybe it was the right one. Arguably, it was the wrong one. But we nonetheless had that choice. And if the Gulf states, again, have it, if they've got a choice between, Iran falls into chaos, or this regime survives in some form, and it will probably be a nasty, vengeful regime, or we could get a democratic Iran, right? How do you think that the Gulf states rank those three different choices? Dan, I'm going to start to you and give Greg a moment to think about it.
Sure. I mean, I think if you actually had a democratic Iran that could be achieved, first of all, I'm for that. But second of all, I think the Gulf states, despite their apprehension about a successful democratic revolution in their neighborhood, would probably be for that too. But they don't see, given that the preponderance of the guns in the country lie with the regime and the regime-aligned forces who number into the several hundreds of thousands, they don't see a way to get there without a civil war. I mean, the regime is held together and hasn't had mass defections, hasn't lost territory, hasn't cracked yet. That could all happen tomorrow, again, taping 9:30 Wednesday morning. But I think that they don't see that as a realistic possibility on the board. I think what they would most like is some kind of an agreement at the end of this that left the regime in place, but tied up some of the loose ends so that there wasn't a kind of constant threat of near war. Short of that, I think weakened Iranian regime in place is probably the next best for them, and the worst is outright chaos.
Greg, how about you? How would you rank them?
Yeah. Well, I'll say that the worst result would be what I talked about before, a regime that doubles down on all its bad elements, that just kind of throws whatever caution it might have had in the past to the wind and says, we are in a fight for our lives and all of these people are our enemies, and just becomes not an imminent threat, but an actual threat constantly to shipping, to missile attacks on the Gulf states. That would be the worst case scenario. I discount the idea both of kind of separatist movements being able to actually uh, achieve any kind of success in a weakened Iran, because except for us and maybe the Israelis, I don't see any regional players that would support that right now. The Saudis might have supported it 10 years ago, but as Dan said, they're in for stability, not chaos right now. Uh, maybe the Kurdish regional government in Iraq would give some assistance to Kurds in Iran, but I don't see the Turks. I don't see, maybe we would in what I would think would be a misbegotten effort, but I'm not sure that we have the wherewithal to support actual separatist movements in Iran. You said in 1991 the U.S. had the choice. We have to remember we actually did both. We fragmented Iraq with the KRG, and we allowed, if you will, the regime to stay in power. But we had troops on the ground, and we're not going to have troops on the ground in Iran. And thus, our ability to really push a post-war Iranian regime one way or another, I think, is much more limited than perhaps people in the White House understand. So I remain, in the belief that for the Gulf states, and to some extent for the United States, the best result is some kind of regime that looks like the current regime, in that there's a clerical element, there's a military element to it, but that makes a strategic decision to kind of alter its regional policy.
Yeah, you're reminding me, Greg, uh, shortly after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, a very a former, very senior Israeli official saying to me about Iraq, what are you people trying to do? Create democracy? Why can't you just find yourself a nice Mubarak? Right, and I think maybe that's what the Gulf states might like to see in Iran. This is terrific stuff. Okay, we've got a whole bunch of questions about it's about China, but I'd like to, or about they're about China, but I'd like to put it to you guys in this way. When this ends, how do you see this shifting Gulf thinking about the US versus China? Will China suddenly become a more attractive alternative than the United States for whatever reason? Or, again, to some points, Greg, that you've made, and I know I'm stretching this, I'm pushing this, so feel free to disagree with me, but it's certainly a trend line in some of the things that you've written. Is there the potential for the Gulf states to say, well, if the threat from Iran is gone, why do we need the Americans? Maybe we don't need them as much as we once did, and therefore maybe the Chinese are a bit more attractive. Greg, I'll start with you, but Dan, I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well.
I think that the first issue one would have to address here, and one that I'm not particularly competent to address, is how do the Chinese read this, right? And not knowing much about China, but having opinions about everything because I'm a political scientist, I can imagine the Chinese saying, for decades we were fine with the stupid Americans being the dominant power in the energy patch, because at least they and we both agreed on the idea that energy should keep flowing out. But now, if we have an America that's attacking the energy patch and leading to the closing of the Straits of Hormuz, maybe we do have to try to develop our own independent military capacity to affect events in the Gulf. That to me will be a really interesting question going forward, and having people who know about China, I would really like to listen to them. So for the next webinar, Ken, get some people who know about China. All right. Secondly, I think that the Gulf states are so tied into the American system on security, on finance, maybe not on economics in terms of trade, but on finance, tied in to the American system. And now they're getting tied in on AI rather than with the Chinese. It does seem to me that they have made a choice that for good or for ill for them, it kind of defines where they're going to be. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't think China is important. They do. China is the biggest. I'll talk about Saudi here. China is the biggest trading partner Saudi Arabia has. Saudis have consistently said to me over the last 10 years, when the kind of anti-China, China-America Cold War talk in the United States was bubbling up, don't make us choose. Don't make us choose between you and China. Right? We need you both. And in that sense, I think that all the Gulf states are going to be open to Chinese initiatives. But when it comes down to kind of security issues and these big ticket economic issues, I think they've made their choice, and it's with us.
Great. Dan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. So in this installment of Middle East Experts Divine Chinese Intentions, my guess would be, with all humility, that they look at this and they say the Americans are so heavily invested in this region with blood, with treasure, with partnerships, with political capital, leadership time, that there's not a lot extra for us. There's not a big angle. I mean, my sense is that over the last year, there's tons of places where America has pulled out or, caused defense that the Chinese haven't rushed to backfill. I think there may be an appeal from within the Gulf to finding alternatives to this kind of U.S. hegemony. But I think they're kind of going in with us militarily. They're watching the awesome power of American military might and capability. They're using the American military training to get what they want. They have all the business deals from last summer and the AI, big bet on AI and investment. So I don't see China having a lot of space to fill within the Gulf. Now, I think if you were to somehow replace Iran's government with a democratic paradise and also figure out how to defang the Iraqi militias and the Houthis, you would probably have a situation where Gulf countries would feel free to be much more multipolar and much less pushed back to the United States by Iranian aggression. That would be an enviable problem to have, I think. And we would want that kind of strategic competition in a much better Middle East. But in the Middle East that we're likely to have at the end of this, where the base case is probably like an Iran that survives, maybe it's what Karim Sajidpour would call that North Korean model rather than the Chinese model for the future of Iran. And the Houthis continue to have capabilities and sit on the Saudi border. And the Iraqi militias continue to be an important conduit for Iranian influence and control in that country and a threat to the United States and to the Gulf states. They're really still threatened from multiple directions unless or until these capabilities are dealt with, and could even be threatened by a nationalist, non-clerical Iran in the future. So I think they're worried about all these issues of balance. They're worried about an Israel military hegemony that's unchecked by Iran as a counterweight. They may find the idea of China appealing, but I think there are some pretty serious bounds on how far that will go in the near to medium term.
Terrific. Okay, so again, we've got some really interesting questions here. I've got one that I think I'm going to put to Greg and another I'm going to put to Dan, but you're welcome to obviously comment on the other answers. So, Greg, how does this war affect, if it does at all, but how do you think it affects Vision 2030? Obviously, that's MBS's signature program. That's the heart of what he's trying to do. What do you think the impact might be?
Well, not good. Vision 2030, in its essence, envisions Saudi Arabia as being a much more important node in the global economy for trade, for tourism, for transportation, and for finance. And we know capital is a coward. It doesn't go into war zones. And to the extent that tourists, investors, business people see the Gulf as a war zone, they've got other places they can invest. And so this is not great for Vision 2030. And I think that despite the hints that maybe the Saudis at the end told Trump, oh yeah, go ahead and do this, I don't think that they have any interest in a conflictual Gulf. Look, MBS, when he came in 2015 as his father's Minister of Defense, and then in 2017 as Crown Prince, he pushed a very aggressive policy against Iran. He signed on to the first Trump administration's maximum pressure policy enthusiastically, and people I'm sure recall the rhetoric. Khamenei is Hitler and all this kind of stuff. We're going to take the fight into Iran, this kind of thing. And then the Iranians kind of showed him what they got when they bombed the Saudi oil facilities in Abqaiq and Khurais in September of 2019. And that began this shift in Saudi foreign policy, which I don't think this war is going to change. I think the Saudis are in for stability, legitimate governments, and economic development more than they're in for geopolitical game playing.
Terrific. Dan, again, welcome to comment on that. But the question for you is, how is this going to affect the Abraham Accords?
Gosh, it's such a good question. First of all, I would just subscribe to everything that Ken said on the last point. But on the Abraham Accords,
Greg, you mean?
Greg,
you're welcome to agree with me.
Yeah,
but
I subscribe to all your
Greg
moderating as well.
Points.
But yeah, no, I think it's kind of tomorrow's issue. It's not today's issue. I think that, while the Americans' defense of the Gulf will probably mitigate the feeling that the Gulf was dragged into a war that they didn't seek, Israel doesn't have the same thing to offer in terms of kind of redeeming quality for some of the Gulf states. I think that before this war, the sort of Saudi Emirati tensions were boiling up, in part because the region was calm. There was sort of time and space to have some of these fights that had been bubbling under the surface since 2020 or 2022. So I think that hopefully the kind of diminishment of that and starting to move past that, as difficult as it is and as much damage was done there, will maybe create a regional alignment where the big regional cleavages aren't pushing Saudi and UAE apart in a way that pushes Saudi apart from Israel. I think Israel's military might and intelligence prowess has been displayed, but it had already been displayed. But I think the big question for Saudi is twofold. One, what do you do on the Palestinian issue to manage public opinion now that you've made clear that that's an important issue for you? And can you find an Israeli government in the future, in an election year in Israel, that can deliver that has the flexibility and the prioritization to deliver that, so that you can move at acceptable political and physical risk forward on this path? And then second is how do you do you need this thing in the way that they might have thought that they needed it before? I think that the weaker Iran is, the less they need it. But still, I think that they are looking at Israel and seeing in Israel, and I mentioned this a couple of times, but I think it's going to be an important part of the narrative after this, that is unchallenged militarily, has America's backing for its military vision, but also doesn't share Saudi Arabia's investment in calm or stability in places like Syria, in places like Iran, and frankly has much more control over where the region goes in some ways when it comes to influence on big American policy choices. Not every time the Gulf got their ceasefire after the bombing of Doha, but I think that is a dynamic to watch closely, and that is a dynamic that kind of militates against normalization. So let's see, Gaza. I'm not sure anyone is paying attention to, in Washington, what's happening in Gaza, but that 20-point plan, the implementation of that effort to disarm Hamas and to find a way forward with the Palestinian Authority, these things all really matter. And they matter to the Saudis in terms of how they see the future of the region. So I think those are things that I'd watch closely.
That's terrific, Dan. Okay, Greg, I'm going to come to you next. And again, if you'd like to add anything to what Dan just said about the Abraham Accords, you're welcome to. But actually several questions we've gotten, which again, great topic, is the impact on this rift that we've seen between the Saudis and the Emiratis, right? This sudden and very dramatic rift that we've seen over the last 3 months. What could be the impact there? One of the questions is, could this overcome it? Could this help them come back together again? Or is this a blip? Or could this push them further apart?
Yeah, Dan stole my thunder a little bit on this one. And I agree with him. For the whole history of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which dates back to 1981, I think that we see a clear pattern that when there is a serious external threat to those countries, they act as one. When there isn't a serious external threat, then their own internal rivalries and divisions emerge in a more salient way. And thus, when this war started, when this conflict started, and the UAE was absorbing the brunt of the Iranian retaliation, the Saudis said we're 100% with you, and MBZ and MBS had the publicly announced phone call, and MBS says all of our capabilities are at your disposal. And so I've always thought that the UAE Saudi rift of the last year or so has been somewhat overplayed. I think that while it's real, it the issues that keep those two countries, the issues that unite those two countries are much greater than the issues that divide them. And so while in the aftermath, if you get a settled down aftermath with one of the better scenarios in terms of what the Iranians look like post war, yeah, there could be some tensions that reemerge, but I think that this conflict will just reemphasize to all the parties in the Gulf that they either hang together or they hang separately.
Perfect. Dan, you want to comment? You want to add anything to that?
Yeah, look, I think that last point is key. They know that they need each other, and this feud was a byproduct of a moment that turned out to be fleeting, of regional calm on other fronts. I wouldn't expect any warm and fuzzies anytime soon between these two leaders, who I think there was a lot of trust that was broken. But I think they know as countries and nations that their interests really align largely when it comes to this fight. I think that has been brought to them. And the well-being and future well-being of the Gulf. I think that it might be tougher for all of the Gulf states to get together if at some point they decide to send a unified message to Washington. That might be made a little more difficult by all of this. But at the end of the day, if the national interests of the countries are aligned, I think the leaders will figure out how to express them.
And if I could add one more thing, Ken, on this, we shouldn't discount the importance of Yemen for Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
It's their long. I think it's their longest border. It's certainly an area where for over a century, the Saudis have basically said this is ours, and they haven't always been able to achieve that. But when other powers get involved in Yemen, the Saudis get neuralgic, and that included, as we could see, the UAE. Yemen is not as direct an interest for the UAE, and we saw the UAE kind of stand down in Yemen when the Saudis displayed their unwillingness to accept what the UAE was encouraging in Yemen. So I also want to echo Dan's idea that it might be tough for the six to get together on anything right now, and partially that's because this administration in particular, I think, has gone against the past administrations who have said, we want the GCC to come together. I think this administration is very comfortable with, if you will, a hub and spokes way to deal with the GCC. Individual deals with individual countries, as opposed to what in the past administrations encouraged, although without much effect, which is kind of military, economic, political integration among the GCC, act like a unit. I think the Trump administration is very happy to deal with the GCC as individual countries.
So, Greg, that's absolutely perfect segue to the next question, which is whether you think that the current war will encourage or enable the Saudis to handle Yemen and the Houthis differently.
All depends on what happens in Iran. I mean, if you get an Iranian government who actively encourages the Houthis to compose their differences with the Saudis and reduces, if not eliminates, its material support to the Houthis, this will encourage something that I think the Saudis would be would look on very favorably, which is some kind of all Yemen conference in an effort to put together, what would be a relatively weak central government in a confederal Yemen, but at least some kind of diplomatic movement on the Yemeni front. The Saudis and the Houthis have in essence maintained their ceasefire now for what, 3.5, 4 years, something like that.
And
Yeah, and I think it's indicative that also the Houthis might be open to something, particularly if the Iranians both encourage them and reduce support. Now, if you have an Iranian post-war regime that doubles down on regional chaos and conflict, I think the Houthis would probably be game for that too.
Great. Okay. Dan, one for you. We asked about Vision 2030, and Greg's handled that. How about the UAE for you, and in particular Dubai? And as one of the questions points out, what's going on now is doubly problematic for Dubai in particular. One, they're getting attacked by Iran. That's not good for business. But also, they had an enormous trade relationship with Iran that's also threatened by this. So, give us your sense of the impact on the Emirati, in particular Dubai's economy over the long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bitter blow. And let me just say on the Houthis first, this war isn't over. So you could easily have the Houthis look different at the end of this war by the time it's done. I think they're watching Israel's actions in Lebanon and waiting to see if they get stretched and pinned on enough different fronts that it's time for the Houthis to kind of make their cameo into this regional war. It really is a shoe that hasn't dropped. Along with the Iraqi militias. So watch that space as this goes on. So we'll see how Yemen looks as well as how Iran looks. As far as Dubai, yeah, I mean, I think outside of Iran, this has been one of the most important hubs of Iranian life, economic life, familial life, commercial, life, etc. So the decision to go after Dubai, as the Iranians have, is very bold and may well be self-defeating over time and reflect their sense of existential concern or just a strategic kind of thinking about some of the particular targets. They've really bitten the hand here in that respect. So I think the model, they're determined to defend the model. They've done so much. All the Gulf countries, I should say, are working to evacuate Americans and foreigners. And just let me say thank you. This would have been my job if this had happened 2 years ago, to evacuate, 70,000 Americans from Saudi, 60,000 from UAE. And I know that the countries are working incredibly closely together to do that and to secure people, to help them evacuate, to pay for hotels in the case of UAE. So first of all, thank you. I'm glad that that's not my job at the moment, but it is incredibly important work. And I'm glad that the Gulf states are serious about doing it. And so I will just say that. But for Dubai, they, MBZ, the ruler of the country, was determined to show the future viability of this model, to walk through a mall, to be among the people, to show that this will still work. Similarly, with the hotels, kind of an effort to showcase that this is a place that will cover down and double down on the international population that's there. I think it will be an incredibly compelling model going forward, but it's true that capital is a coward, and this will certainly take a dent when you think about things like, data centers and other areas and global corporations that can be ruthless about whether they want to go to Singapore or Dubai or Dublin. You may see some different choices. I think that would be very unfortunate, but I think the Emiratis have a lot of tools in their arsenal when things calm down to remain globally economically competitive, and I'm sure they will use them all.
Dan, Greg, I'm afraid that's all that we have the time for. And I really mean it when I say I'm afraid that that's all that we have the time for, because this was absolutely sensational. And for the almost 400 people who joined us on this, I hope everyone recognizes just how unbelievably smart and insightful this conversation was. It was so much better than anything that I have been seeing out there in the media and on the airwaves. Greg, Dan, I cannot thank you guys enough. Thank you so much, and can't wait to have you guys back.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care, all. And for those interested, later on this afternoon, we're going to be doing a similar Zoom webinar on Israel and its role in the conflict. Join us then. That'll be at 2 o'clock Washington time. Take care.